All right, are we on track for net zero? No. Lecture over. It's not. It's obviously more interesting than that. Let's just delve into the same path. I'm really reusing this chart, so I find it very illustrative. The Prime Minister, you might recall, made a speech about a month ago on the 20th of September in Downing Street. Now, it was a surprise to us that he made that speech. It wasn't a very welcome one. But in that speech, he talked about effectively a kind of reset for net zero. And I'm going to talk briefly about that speech now, because I think it's probably the easiest way to determine whether the UK at least is on track for net zero. What he said in that speech is very interesting, and I'll refer back to just a couple of bits of it. One of the things that he said, and I was glad to hear it, is that he is fully committed to achieving the targets that the country has. And I don't know whether he was thinking that weeks prior to it. I had heard otherwise, but he did commit very publicly to hitting those targets, and I'm very glad of that. The most important of the targets that he committed to is not net zero. Obviously net zero is important, but what's important is what we do in the short term. So the most important of the targets he has committed to, and he did so twice on that day, was this, which is called the NDC, which is the 2030 target that we set in Glasgow and offered to the world. That's where it is on that pathway. It was the target that we advised, so it's reducing emissions by 68% from 1990 levels. You might see it's slightly below the carbon budget, so it's an important one for us because it basically keeps the path in play. So let's just look at what it would take to hit that 2030 pledge. So this is some nice analysis we did just a few months ago. The data that we have on emissions is from 2022. So we can ask ourselves quite an interesting question. Where were we 8 years prior to 2022? And what would it take for the 8 years that come next to get to the 2030 target? So this is the annual rate of reduction that we've seen in the 8 years prior to 2022 and the 8 years that will come after it if we're going to hit that target by sector. What you see is that story I told you earlier of the power sector doing a lot of the work. So you can see the yellow line there is what we did 8 years prior. So you can see that we're really reducing emissions very quickly in the electricity sector. And we actually don't need to achieve that pace into the future for power, we think, if you want to hit that 2030 goal. But in every other sector, you can see that the pace of progress in reducing emissions in the 8 years prior to 2022 was slower than the pace of progress we'll need to hit the 2030 goal on time and with great aplomb. And you can see actually for some of those sectors it's a very dramatic increase in pace that you would need. So that's one way of looking at it. This is, I think, a probably even more instructive way of looking at it, particularly for those at the back. So standing back from it at whole economy level, we can do exactly the same thing. So looking at all of the emissions in the economy in the 8 years prior to 2022, 8 years after 2022. If you take out shipping and aviation, which are still doing funny things after the pandemic, if you look at that, we've achieved about 3% reduction in emissions each year in the 8 years prior to 2022. That needs to double to hit the 2030 target. But that includes the power sector. So if you take the power sector out, because we know that's been working, we've got good policy in place for that, look at what's happening outside of the power sector. It's only 1% per year. So we've been reducing emissions by 1% per year. That needs to quadruple over the next 8 years if we're going to hit the 2030 target. And I think the main challenge I have really to the Prime Minister is, do you believe that you have a policy programme in place that would achieve that? Because I do not. I don't think that we have a policy programme in place that will quadruple the effort to decarbonise outside of the power sector.